A desperate gamble in the void. The dim glow of the docking bay lights cast long shadows across the worn-out plating of orbital station Tetra 5. Kayla Voss, a lone human mechanic, wiped the grease from her fingers as she crouched near an old service panel. The air smelled of metal, coolant, and the faintest trace of fried circuits. She had been working for hours, trying to salvage what she could from a broken-down transport vessel that would never fly again. For the past 3 weeks, Kayla had been stranded here, trying to gather enough credits to leave. The problem was, she had none. Her last job had fallen apart when her employer, a Zelthian merchant, skipped the station without paying her a single credit. Now, she was stuck, no fuel, no supplies, and barely enough rations to last another day. She didn't belong in a place like this. Tetra 5 was a melting pot of outcasts, smugglers, and those too desperate to go anywhere else. Humans were a minority out here on the galactic fringes, and for the most part, people kept their distance. Some out of curiosity, others out of contempt. Her stomach clenched painfully, and she exhaled sharply. Food. That was her biggest problem now. Without credits, she had nothing to trade, and station security had already warned her against loitering near the food dispensaries. She had seen what happened to people who overstayed their welcome here. As she pulled herself to her feet, the familiar hiss of an airlock caught her attention. Across the bay, a new ship was docking, its hull battered and scarred from what looked like a recent skirmish. Kayla's engineers took in the damage immediately, reactor shielding compromised, power conduits half melted, and judging by the flickering lights, its navigation core was failing. A handful of figures stepped off the boarding ramp, their forms shadowed by the dim lighting. Kayla didn't need to guess, mercenaries. Probably bounty hunters or hired guns returning from a job. She turned to leave, but as she did, one of them stumbled. A tall alien, humanoid in shape but with onyx black skin marbled with faint golden veins, collapsed onto one knee. His armor was cracked, one of his arms clutching his side, where dark blue blood seeped between his fingers. His breath came in ragged gasps. Kayla hesitated. Logic told her to keep moving. If he was a mercenary, that meant he was dangerous, and whoever shot him might still be close behind. But something in her gut, that damn human instinct to help, kept her from turning away. She stepped forward. "You need medical." Her voice was cautious but firm. The alien lifted his head, and glowing amber eyes locked onto hers. There was a flicker of surprise, maybe he hadn't expected a human to speak his language. Then his expression hardened. "I need a mechanic." His voice was deep, laced with pain but steady. Kayla's brows furrowed. She glanced at his ship. Now it made sense. If his reactor core was unstable, he wouldn't last long on a damaged ship. A malfunction like that could detonate under the wrong conditions. She should have walked away. Instead, she said, "I can fix it. But I need something in return." His breath came in slow, measured intervals. His kind, whatever they were, weren't known for trusting outsiders. But something in her tone must have convinced him. He gave a slow nod. "Fix my ship, and I'll get you off this station." Kayla didn't hesitate. She extended a hand. A deal was struck. A desperate gamble in the void. The dim glow of the docking bay lights cast long shadows across the worn-out plating of orbital station Tetra 5. Kayla Voss, a lone human mechanic, wiped the grease from her fingers as she crouched near an old service panel. The air smelled of metal, coolant, and the faintest trace of fried circuits. She had been working for hours, trying to salvage what she could from a broken-down transport vessel that would never fly again. For the past 3 weeks, Kayla had been stranded here, trying to gather enough credits to leave. The problem was, she had none. Her last job had fallen apart when her employer, a Zelthian merchant, skipped the station without paying her a single credit. Now, she was stuck, no fuel, no supplies, and barely enough rations to last another day. She didn't belong in a place like this. Tetra 5 was a melting pot of outcasts, smugglers, and those too desperate to go anywhere else. Humans were a minority out here on the galactic fringes, and for the most part, people kept their distance. Some out of curiosity, others out of contempt. Her stomach clenched painfully, and she exhaled sharply. Food. That was her biggest problem now. Without credits, she had nothing to trade, and station security had already warned her against loitering near the food dispensaries. She had seen what happened to people who overstayed their welcome here. As she pulled herself to her feet, the familiar hiss of an airlock caught her attention. Across the bay, a new ship was docking, its hull battered and scarred from what looked like a recent skirmish. Kayla's engineers took in the damage immediately, reactor shielding compromised, power conduits half melted, and judging by the flickering lights, its navigation core was failing. A handful of figures stepped off the boarding ramp, their forms shadowed by the dim lighting. Kayla didn't need to guess, mercenaries. Probably bounty hunters or hired guns returning from a job. She turned to leave, but as she did, one of them stumbled. A tall alien, humanoid in shape but with onyx-black skin marbled with faint golden veins, collapsed onto one knee. His armor was cracked, one of his arms clutching his side, where dark blue blood seeped between his fingers. His breath came in ragged gasps. Kayla hesitated. Logic told her to keep moving. If he was a mercenary, that meant he was dangerous, and whoever shot him might still be close behind. But something in her gut, that damn human instinct to help, kept her from turning away. She stepped forward. "You need medical." Her voice was cautious but firm. The alien lifted his head, and glowing amber eyes locked onto hers. There was a flicker of surprise, maybe he hadn't expected a human to speak his language. Then his expression hardened. "I need a mechanic." His voice was deep, laced with pain but steady. Kayla's brows furrowed. She glanced at his ship. Now it made sense. If his reactor core was unstable, he wouldn't last long on a damaged ship. A malfunction like that could detonate under the wrong conditions. She should have walked away. Instead, she said, "I can fix it. But I need something in return." His breath came in slow, measured intervals. His kind, whatever they were, weren't known for trusting outsiders. But something in her tone must have convinced him. He gave a slow nod. "Fix my ship, and I'll get you off this station." Kayla didn't hesitate. She extended a hand. A deal was struck. The price on their heads. Kayla's pulse quickened as she watched the bounty hunters move into the docking bay, their armor gleaming under the dim station lights. There were 5 of them, all heavily armed, and they moved with the precise efficiency of professionals. They weren't here by accident. They were hunting. And judging by the way their weapons were drawn, they weren't planning on taking prisoners. Rhaegar exhaled sharply, pushing himself up despite the pain radiating from his side. His golden-veined skin seemed to glow under the emergency lights, his amber eyes narrowing as he took in the approaching squad. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked tired. "I was wondering how long it would take them," he muttered. Kayla shot him a sharp look. "They're here for you." "Not just me," he said grimly. "If you're standing next to me, you're part of the bounty now." Her stomach turned at his words, but deep down, she had expected something like this. Rhaegar wasn't just a random mercenary with a broken ship, he was a target. And if someone was willing to send a high-level bounty squad after him, then he wasn't just any target. She had walked right into something big. And now, it was too late to back out. "Do they know you're wounded?" she asked under her breath, scanning the squad's formation. They were spreading out, covering the exits. They were taking their time. That meant they weren't afraid of him, or, more likely, they thought they had already won. "They'll figure it out soon enough," Rhaegar replied, his jaw tightening. Which means we have about 60 seconds before they try to put a hole in us. Kayla glanced at the ship's control panel. The startup sequence was running, but the system was still cycling. They weren't ready for takeoff. Even if they sprinted aboard now, the ship wouldn't be able to clear the docking clamps before the hunters gunned them down. She needed a distraction. She turned to Rhaegar. "Can you still fight?" Rhaegar smirked despite his pain. "You'd be surprised what adrenaline can do." "Good. Buy me some time," she said, already moving. She darted toward the ship's exterior maintenance panel, yanking open a control hatch. The station's docking clamps were engaged, and the only way to release them faster was to override the system manually. It was a dangerous move. If she made a mistake, she could disable the ship permanently, but right now, the alternative was death. Behind her, Rhaegar stepped forward, drawing his weapon in a smooth motion. The bounty hunters spotted him instantly. The lead enforcer, a broad-shouldered figure in reinforced combat gear, raised his rifle. "Rhaegar Voss," he called out, his voice crackling over his helmet speakers. "You've got a price on your head big enough to buy a whole star system. Be smart. Lay down your weapon." Rhaegar's fingers flexed around his gun. "And let you walk me into a holding cell for the rest of my life?" His tone was calm, but Kayla could see the way his muscles tensed, coiled for action. "I think I'll pass." The enforcer sighed. "Didn't think you'd make this easy." He gestured, and two of the hunters opened fire. Rhaegar moved like lightning, diving to the side as plasma rounds tore through the air. He fired back, his shots precise despite his injury. One of the hunters went down with a pained grunt, his armor sizzling from the impact. The others adjusted quickly, spreading out to flank him. Kayla gritted her teeth, forcing herself to ignore the gunfire as she worked. Her hands flew over the control panel, rerouting power and forcing the clamps to disengage. A red warning flashed on the screen. Manual override detected. Unauthorized release in progress. Come on, come on. A sharp explosion rocked the bay as one of the mercs tossed a grenade, sending a shockwave of heat and pressure rippling through the docking area. Kayla barely kept her balance, her hands gripping the panel for support. Through the smoke, she saw Rhaegar struggling. His movements were still fast, still deadly, but he was slowing down. His wound was sapping his strength. She didn't think. She just acted. Snatching up a discarded plasma pistol from the ground, she aimed and fired at the nearest merc. The shot wasn't perfect, but it hit hard enough to make him stumble. Before he could recover, Kayla fired again, this time striking a weak point in his armor. He went down hard. Rhaegar glanced at her, eyes flickering with something between surprise and approval. "Not bad," he admitted. Kayla ignored him, turning back to the control panel. The final override was almost complete. Just a few more seconds. The lead enforcer cursed. "Enough of this." He raised his rifle, aiming directly at Kayla. She barely had time to react, her breath caught, her muscles tensed, when a blur of motion cut through the air. Rhaegar lunged forward, his body moving faster than seemed possible. His blade flashed, catching the enforcer's rifle and knocking it aside just as the trigger was pulled. The shot missed Kayla by inches, searing into the metal panel beside her. Rhaegar twisted, driving his weapon into the enforcer's armor. The man gasped, then collapsed. Everything went still for half a second. Then Kayla's console beeped. The docking clamps released. "Now," she shouted. Rhaegar didn't hesitate. He turned, grabbing Kayla's wrist and dragging her toward the ship. The remaining bounty hunters fired after them, but the blast doors of the interceptor were already closing as they stumbled aboard. The second they were inside, Kayla launched herself into the cockpit, slamming her hands onto the controls. The ship lurched as the docking bay doors began to seal shut. If they didn't move now, they'd be locked inside the station with no way out. "Hold on," she warned, gripping the thrusters. Rhaegar, still bleeding, barely had time to strap himself into the co-pilot seat before the ship roared to life. Kayla yanked the controls, pushing the interceptor into a steep vertical climb as it shot through the bay doors just before they slammed shut. The station's automated defense systems kicked in immediately, but the ship was too fast. Plasma turrets fired wildly as Kayla twisted through the debris field, dodging incoming fire with every ounce of skill she had. And then, just like that, they were out. Tetra 5 shrank behind them, the planet below spinning lazily in the void. Kayla exhaled sharply, her body still trembling from the rush of adrenaline. She turned to Rhaegar, who was slumped in his seat, his breathing shallow. His injury was worse than he let on. "You still alive?" she asked. Rhaegar let out a rough chuckle. "Define alive." She rolled her eyes, already reaching for the ship's medkit. They weren't safe yet. Whoever had sent those bounty hunters wouldn't stop just because they had escaped the station. There was more to this than Rhaegar was telling her. And now, like it or not, she was caught in the middle of it. She tossed him a bandage. "You better be worth all this trouble." Rhaegar gave her a lopsided grin, despite the pain. "Trust me. You're gonna be glad you took this job." Kayla wasn't sure if that was a promise or a warning. Either way, there was no turning back now. No safe haven. The hum of the ship's engine filled the cabin, steady but uneven. Kayla kept a firm grip on the controls, making micro-adjustments as they hurtled through the void. The interceptor was holding together, barely. She had done a good enough patch job to keep the systems from failing mid-flight, but it wasn't meant for long-distance travel in this condition. And now, thanks to that little stunt at Tetra 5, they were running for their lives. Rhaegar was slumped in the co-pilot's seat, his breathing shallow, his armor still slick with his own blood. He had tried to bandage himself up, but Kayla could see the strain in his movements. His body was running on pure willpower. She tossed him a medical injector from the emergency kit. "Use it," she ordered. "You'll be dead before we hit our next jump point if you don't." He caught the injector with sluggish fingers, looking at it for a second before pressing it into his side. A soft hiss sounded as the stimulant flooded his system, dulling the pain and kickstarting his healing process. He inhaled sharply, his amber eyes flickering with renewed focus. "You're getting bossy," he muttered. Kayla shot him a glare. "I just saved your life. Again. You can deal with it." Despite everything, a small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment. "Where are we going?" "That's what I was about to ask you." She brought up the NAV screen, displaying the available jump points. "I don't know who's after you, but I doubt they're going to give up after one failed ambush. So unless you have a really good hiding place, we're flying blind." Rhaegar's eyes remained closed, but his expression darkened. "There's a contact. Someone who owes me a favor. Small outpost in the drift sectors, unregistered. They'll have supplies." Kayla didn't like the sound of that. Unregistered outposts meant black market dealers, mercenaries, and the kind of people who considered betrayal just another business transaction. She glanced at him again, narrowing her eyes. "You trust them?" Rhaegar's jaw tightened. "I trust them to want me alive more than they want me dead." Not exactly comforting. But it wasn't like they had many options. She sighed, inputting the coordinates. "All right, mystery mercenary. One unregistered outpost, coming right up." She engaged the ship's jump drive, feeling the subtle shift in gravity as the engines built up charge. Within seconds, the surrounding stars stretched into infinity, and the ship jumped into slipstream. The moment they left real space, the tension in her shoulders eased, just slightly. They had a head start now, at least. But she knew it wouldn't last. She turned to Rhaegar. "You want to tell me why bounty hunters are after you? Or am I just supposed to guess?" His expression remained unreadable. You don't want to know. Kayla scoffed. I think I deserve an explanation, considering I just almost got vaporized helping you escape. Twice. He was silent for a long moment, as if debating whether to tell her the truth. Then he exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. It's not just a bounty. It's a contract. Open-ended, no expiration. Someone really powerful wants me dead. Kayla's stomach tightened. Open-ended contracts meant whoever put the bounty on him didn't just want him caught, they wanted him erased. The kind of money that took meant political backing. Corporate level. Maybe worse. She folded her arms. What did you do? I was part of something big. A project. His voice was low, heavy. Something that was never supposed to exist. When I found out what they were really doing, I got out. Took the evidence with me. Kayla frowned. Evidence of what? He hesitated. Human experimentation. The words sent a chill down her spine. She had seen a lot of dark things working on the fringes of civilization, but nothing was as dangerous as corporations or governments tampering with genetic experiments. Especially if it involved humans. She narrowed her eyes. Who? Rhaegar shook his head. You don't want to be in this any deeper than you already are. Kayla clenched her jaw. Too late for that, don't you think? Before he could answer, the ship's proximity alarms blared. Kayla spun back to the controls. The NAV screen flashed red, displaying 3 inbound vessels, fast, heavily armed, and closing in on their position. She didn't recognize the transponder codes, but the way they were moving told her everything she needed to know. They weren't just tracking them. They had been waiting for them. She cursed under her breath. Looks like your friends are still on our trail. Rhaegar's eyes snapped to the screen. His expression darkened. Those aren't bounty hunters. Kayla tensed. Then who? Before she could finish the question, the ship rocked violently as a warning shot blasted past their hull. A voice crackled over the comms, cold and authoritative. Unidentified vessel, you are harboring a fugitive of the Dominion. Power down your engines and prepare for boarding. Kayla's heart pounded. Dominion. That was a name she did recognize. The Dominion Research Conglomerate, a private military-backed organization with its hands in everything from planetary development to Black Ops experimentation. They had a reputation for making people disappear. If they were after Rhaegar, that meant whatever he was running from was bigger than she had imagined. She turned to him, eyes wide. Tell me you have a plan. Rhaegar's hands tightened into fists. His breathing was steadier now, the stimulant working through his system. Yeah. 1. He pushed himself to his feet, moving toward the weapons locker. We don't let them board. Kayla swallowed hard, adrenaline surging through her veins. This wasn't just about running anymore. They were going to have to fight their way out. The ship shook violently as another warning shot streaked past the hull. Kayla's hands gripped the controls, her breath shallow. The 3 Dominion ships were closing in fast, moving with the kind of precision that told her this wasn't just a random interception, this was a trap. They had been waiting for them to come out of slipstream. Someone had anticipated their route. Rhaegar was already moving, his injuries forgotten in the face of immediate danger. He unlatched a weapons locker near the back of the cockpit, pulling out a compact plasma rifle. He checked the charge, then turned to Kayla. You ever been in a real fight before? Kayla shot him a sharp look. I grew up fixing ships on backwater stations. What do you think? Rhaegar let out a dry chuckle. Great. First lesson, don't get shot. She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Instead, she flicked on the ship's defensive scanners, trying to find a way out of this mess. The Dominion ships were fast, too fast for a direct escape, but they hadn't started firing to disable them yet. That meant they wanted Rhaegar alive. Which meant they had leverage. Her stomach twisted. The comms crackled again. Last chance. Surrender the fugitive, and you will not be harmed. Kayla didn't believe that for a second. Rhaegar exhaled slowly. We're outgunned. They've got 3 cruisers, and we have a half-broken interceptor. We need to be smart. Then think fast, Kayla snapped, twisting the ship's trajectory as the Dominion ship spread out in a pincer formation. Because in about 30 seconds, we're out of options. Rhaegar's eyes flickered toward the cargo bay controls. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. How much do you like improvising? Kayla groaned. You're about to do something reckless, aren't you? Yup. Before she could protest, he rushed toward the ship's interior, keying in a manual override to the cargo bay doors. The moment he did, Kayla's cockpit sensors flashed red. Rhaegar, what the hell are you? Then she saw it. One of the cargo containers, a high-density gravcore, was ejected straight into the path of the Dominion ships. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the container detonated in a massive burst of energy, disrupting the gravitational field around the enemy ships. Kayla's eyes widened. You just turned a reactor core into a bomb. Rhaegar's voice crackled through the ship's internal comms. Correction, a distraction. The explosion wasn't enough to destroy the Dominion ships, but it sent their trajectory into chaos, forcing them to adjust their positioning. The brief gap in their formation was all Kayla needed. She didn't hesitate. Gripping the controls, she dived straight into the opening, pushing the ship to its absolute limit. The engines groaned under the strain, the hull rattling as she wove between the Dominion vessels, twisting into a steep escape vector. Plasma fire streaked past them. The Dominion wasn't holding back anymore. They had realized their mistake. Kayla's teeth clenched. Hold together, girl. Come on. A warning klaxon blared. Target lock detected. Her heart jumped into her throat. The Dominion had locked on with a missile. Rhaegar stormed back into the cockpit, gripping the side of her chair. Do we have countermeasures? Kayla's fingers flew over the controls. Unless you count throwing another explosive out the back, no. Rhaegar cursed under his breath. The missile was closing in fast. They had seconds before it struck. Then Kayla saw it, a gravitational anomaly ahead. A rogue debris field, a drifting cluster of abandoned ships and forgotten wreckage, pulled together by an unstable gravity well. It was suicidal to fly into it. But at this moment, it was their only chance. She made a snap decision. Brace yourself, she shouted, and jerked the controls hard. The ship plunged toward the wreckage at full speed, dodging between massive, tumbling chunks of metal and twisted wrecks. The Dominion missile followed, its tracking system locked on. Rhaegar's grip tightened. That missile's gonna catch us. Not if I time this right. Kayla's eyes locked onto a partially destroyed battleship floating dead ahead. An old Dominion warship, its hull fractured, its core half exposed. She accelerated toward it. At the last possible second, she twisted the ship straight through the broken hull, skimming dangerously close to the debris field. The missile followed. But it didn't make it out the other side. The moment it impacted the wreck, the entire structure detonated, sending a massive shockwave through the debris field. Kayla's ship rocked violently as she fought for control, barely managing to stabilize before pulling them into open space. For a moment, there was silence. Then Rhaegar let out a slow, disbelieving breath. You're insane. Kayla let out a breathless laugh, her hands shaking from the adrenaline. Took you long enough to notice. The sensor readout blinked, the Dominion ships were gone. Either destroyed or left behind in the explosion. They had escaped. But Kayla knew better than to celebrate. Rhaegar exhaled, leaning heavily against the console. His face was pale, his strength fading again. We need to get to that outpost. Kayla nodded, inputting the coordinates. The ship was barely holding together, the fuel reserves running low, and she still had 1,000 questions about what exactly she had just gotten herself into. But there was one thing she knew for sure. This wasn't over. And whatever secrets Rhaegar was carrying, they were dangerous enough that the Dominion was willing to kill for them. Kayla just hoped she hadn't made a mistake choosing this side of the fight. She engaged the next jump. The stars stretched, and the ship vanished into slipstream. The outpost in the void. The ship lurched violently as they exited slipstream, the worn-out thrusters sputtering under the strain. Kayla fought the controls, her hands slick with sweat, her muscles aching from the intensity of their escape. The Dominion was behind them for now, but she knew that wouldn't last. They would track them again. They always did. A massive, jagged asteroid loomed ahead, its surface pockmarked with impact craters and industrial scars. The outpost, or what passed for one, was nestled within a deep trench, hidden from direct scans. From a distance, it looked like little more than a derelict mining station, long abandoned by any official presence. Rhaegar exhaled, his voice weaker than before. Set us down. Landing bay is on the far side. Kayla didn't argue. She was running on fumes herself, exhaustion clawing at the edges of her mind. She guided the ship in, maneuvering carefully as they descended into the outpost's cavernous docking bay. The moment the landing struts engaged, the ship shuddered, something in the undercarriage gave way, and a loud metallic snap echoed through the hull. Kayla winced. I don't think we'll be taking off anytime soon. Rhaegar smirked, but there was no real amusement in it. You'll fix it. She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Right now, there were bigger problems. The docking bay was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering weakly. The place smelled of oil, metal, and something acrid, like burnt ozone. Scattered across the space were half-assembled ships, crates of illegal tech, and automated sentry turrets, silent but watching. This was a place for people who didn't want to be found. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the docking bay. Kayla tensed, instinctively shifting closer to Rhaegar. He was still bleeding, still pale, but he straightened when the figures emerged from the shadows. 3 of them. The leader was a tall, broad-shouldered woman with cybernetic enhancements running down her left arm, her dark eyes unreadable. Her gaze flicked between Rhaegar and Kayla before settling on the mercenary. You look like hell, Rhaegar, she said dryly. Feel worse, he admitted. Kayla's fingers twitched toward the pistol strapped to her hip, but Rhaegar caught the movement and gave her a slight shake of his head. Not yet. The woman's cybernetic fingers flexed. You brought company. Had to, Rhaegar said. She saved my life. Kayla arched a brow. That was one way to put it. The woman studied Kayla for a moment, then exhaled. You always bring me trouble, Rhaegar. First it was the stolen data. Now it's a full-blown Dominion hunt. Kayla's stomach tightened. Stolen data. That was what this was all about. Rhaegar nodded, his expression grim. They haven't stopped coming. And they won't, the woman said, crossing her arms. You should have dumped that information the moment you stole it. Instead, you ran. Because it's more than just data, Rhaegar shot back. His voice had an edge now, frustration bleeding through. You know what they're doing. What they've been doing. Kayla stepped forward. Someone tell me what exactly we're running from. No more half-truths. The woman turned to her, studying her carefully. Then she sighed. The Dominion isn't just experimenting on humans. They're breeding something. Creating hybrids. Soldiers. Things that shouldn't exist. Kayla's blood ran cold. You're saying they're making a new species? More like weaponizing one, Rhaegar corrected. They're splicing human genetics with other species, enhancing adaptability, strength, reflexes. But the process is brutal. The failures don't survive. Kayla felt sick. She had heard rumors about Dominion bioengineering projects before, but nothing like this. Nothing this horrific. She turned back to Rhaegar. "And you stole proof?" He nodded. "Everything. Locations, research logs, test subjects, names." Kayla swallowed hard. "So what's the plan? Hide here forever?" The cybernetic woman smirked. "Not exactly. There's a buyer. Someone willing to expose all of this, if we can get them the data." Kayla didn't like how that sounded. A buyer? That's the plan. Sell it and hope someone does the right thing. The woman's expression darkened. "If you have a better idea, I'm all ears." Kayla hesitated. The truth was, she didn't. They were up against something massive, something beyond anything she had ever faced. But there was one thing she knew. "You can't just sell this," she said. "Not to a single buyer. If the Dominion finds out who has it, they'll bury it. You need to spread it, everywhere. Every system, every colony. Make it impossible to erase." The woman and Rhaegar exchanged glances. "She's not wrong," Rhaegar admitted. "We can't trust one person with this. We need to make it public." The woman exhaled sharply. "That's a hell of a risk." Kayla folded her arms. "So is doing nothing." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, the woman nodded. "All right. We do it your way. But that means we need a secure broadcast station. And the closest one is deep in Dominion space." Kayla's stomach tightened. Of course it was. Rhaegar smirked. "Guess we're going back to where it all started." Kayla let out a slow breath. She had been running for so long, trying to escape the gravity of other people's wars. But now, she was in it, whether she liked it or not. She turned back toward the ship. "Then we better fix the damn engine. The last transmission." Kayla's hands moved quickly over the ship's engine components, her fingers slick with grease and sweat. The outpost's dim lighting flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the worn metal plating of the docking bay. Every second counted. The Dominion wouldn't stop hunting them, and now they were heading straight into the fire, deep into Dominion-controlled space to broadcast the truth to the entire galaxy. It was reckless, probably suicidal, but it was the only way to make sure the stolen data wasn't buried. Rhaegar stood nearby, reloading his plasma rifle, his wounds hastily patched but still aching. He was pushing through the pain, his mind already set on the fight ahead. The cybernetic woman, Lexa, was in the cockpit, working on rerouting their ship's signature so they could avoid immediate detection when they jumped. The plan was simple but dangerous. First, they would slip past the Dominion patrols and reach Relay Station Sigma-9, a deep space transmission hub used for encrypted corporate communications. It was the only place powerful enough to send a signal that couldn't be intercepted or erased. Once the data was out, every independent news network, every rebellion, every government faction with an interest in keeping the Dominion in check would have the proof. But Sigma-9 was heavily guarded. And the moment they powered up the broadcast, the Dominion would know. Kayla let out a sharp breath, wiping her forehead. The ship's repairs were as good as they were going to get. "We're ready," she called out. Lexa nodded, her cybernetic eye flashing with data. "Then let's not waste time." Rhaegar stepped toward the cockpit, his voice low. "Once we start this, there's no turning back." Kayla met his gaze. "There was no turning back the moment you stepped off your ship at Tetra 5. A flicker of something passed through his eyes, respect, maybe something deeper, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he strapped into the co-pilot's seat as Kayla powered up the thrusters. The ship groaned, still damaged but functional. It would hold. It had to. With a deep breath, Kayla punched in the coordinates and engaged the slipstream drive. The stars stretched into infinity, and they vanished into the void. Relay Station Sigma 9 came into view like a silent monolith against the blackness of space. The station was massive. An orbital relay hub covered in transmission arrays and security turrets. Dominion patrol ships floated around its perimeter, scanning for unauthorized vessels. The entire structure pulsed with the hum of encrypted data, a digital fortress of information. Lexa brought up the display. There's a weak point on the station's lower level. If we dock there, we can access the main control hub without triggering an immediate lockdown. Kayla tightened her grip on the controls. Sounds easy. Lexa smirked. It's not. Rhaegar leaned forward. The moment we breach, they'll send reinforcements. We need to lock them out of the security system long enough to transmit the data. Kayla nodded, already forming a plan. Then we'll need distraction fire while I get the transmission running. Rhaegar gave her a knowing look. I was hoping you'd say that. The ship's stealth systems flickered on as Kayla guided them toward the station's lower docking bay. They drifted in carefully, avoiding the main security sweeps. The instant the clamps engaged, alarms blared throughout the station. Here we go, Lexa muttered, grabbing her weapon. The ship's hatch hissed open, and they moved fast. Kayla sprinted toward the main broadcast controls, her heart hammering. Rhaegar and Lexa stayed behind, weapons drawn as Dominion soldiers swarmed the docking bay. Blaster fire erupted. Rhaegar took down the first wave with brutal precision, moving like a shadow between cover, while Lexa's cybernetic arm emitted a pulse blast, knocking 2 guards off their feet. Kayla hacked into the broadcast console, her fingers flying over the controls. The station's firewalls were strong, but she had learned a few tricks over the years. With a few bypasses and brute force decryption, the system unlocked. Transmission uplink engaged, she whispered. She uploaded the stolen files, all of it. Every experiment, every test subject, every horrifying detail the Dominion had tried to hide. The truth. The screen flashed data broadcasting. Suddenly, an authoritative voice boomed over the station speakers. Cease transmission immediately, or you will be terminated. Kayla's blood went cold. She turned to see a figure stepping through the chaos, a Dominion officer, his uniform immaculate, his presence commanding. Rhaegar tensed beside her. That's him. Kayla's breath caught. The one behind all this? The officer smiled coldly. The one who tried to stop it. Before Kayla could react, the officer raised a weapon, a sleek, experimental pistol that hummed with unstable energy. He aimed straight at the control panel. Kayla moved on instinct. She lunged forward, slamming into him just as he fired. The shot missed the panel by inches, scorching the wall. She wrestled with him, her strength nothing compared to his, but she wasn't alone. Rhaegar was already there. A single, precise shot echoed through the room, and the officer crumpled, his weapon clattering to the floor. For a moment, there was silence. Then the console beeped. Kayla turned, her chest heaving. The display flashed transmission complete. The Dominion's secret was out. She let out a slow, disbelieving breath. We did it. But the station was still on full alert. We need to go, now, Lexa said, already moving toward the exit. Kayla turned to follow, but then her eyes landed on something, the officer's fallen weapon, still humming with unspent energy. Something about it felt wrong. She picked it up. Kayla! Rhaegar shouted. She snapped out of it, tucking the weapon into her belt as she ran after them. They sprinted back to the ship, dodging enemy fire as alarms continued to blare. The moment they were aboard, Kayla launched them into slipstream, leaving the burning station behind. As they drifted through deep space, the adrenaline finally faded. The weight of what they had done settled in. The Dominion's biggest secret was now public. Governments, independent factions, and even the Dominion's own people would demand answers. Kayla exhaled, slumping into her seat. We just made a lot of enemies. Rhaegar, sitting beside her, let out a low chuckle. We also made a lot of allies. She looked at him, searching his face. There was relief there, maybe even hope. For the first time, she felt it too. Lexa smirked. Well, I'd say it's been fun, but I don't think the Dominion is done with us yet. Kayla glanced at the strange weapon still in her grip. She didn't know what it was, but something told her this fight was far from over. She met Rhaegar's gaze. So what now? He smirked. Now. We see how far this revolution goes. Kayla let out a slow breath, staring out at the endless stars ahead. No more running. No more hiding. The fight had just begun.